All right, we are now live for the May AMA. This is the Ask Me Anything session. I do these monthly, so I'm coming in a little bit early because I see we've already got a lot of questions here. And let me say hi to Mark, Mark Smith. He asks, what do you think is Plato's worst dialogue and why is it the laws? So it's one of those things that we call a loaded question, like, have you quit beating your wife lately? It's kind of funny. I actually have a story about the laws. I think it's actually pretty good, but I'm always looking at Plato not to have these works as single things by themselves, but to like fill in details about the Platonic way of looking at things. And so when I was in graduate school, I read Windelband's History of Philosophy, and he called the laws Plato's senile work, which I think was a very common point of view among German scholars at the time about Plato's works. And there's no craziness that some German scholar won't come up with in terms of interpreting Plato in the 19th century. And I bought into that, which was stupid to do, without reading the laws for myself. And I was like, well, why would I read them then? And then when I read them later on, I thought, oh, this is actually pretty good stuff. So that's, kind of a lesson learned, right? All right, let me jump up to the top. Isaac says, do you have any favorite or preferred texts on the subject of free will? I mean, I don't have a favorite. I usually don't have favorites about much of anything these days. I will have like things that I do like in general. As a matter of fact, that would be a good video to do, like a top 10 works on a particular topic. I don't talk much about free will because I think that the waters have been so muddied by people using that term in all sorts of ways. I'm less interested in that as like a free will or not free will, and more like, okay, it's clear that we do have some degree of freedom. How do we conceptualize that? How do we make sense of that? Is there any way to augment that freedom? Are there things that restrict our freedom? And I would say if you look at it in that way, we've already got discussions happening in Aristotle, important discussions in not just Nicomachean Ethics Book 3, but also in Politics and other places as well, where he's considering what's voluntary and involuntary and how we should, look at the actions that people do. And then we've got the Stoics, and this is clearly a central issue for the Stoics, and I think that's quite interesting. The Epicureans definitely felt this to be an issue because we know this from Cicero's On Fate, and they kind of screwed it up, with their appeal to the swerve. And then it just goes on from there, right? We've got some really great discussions in early Christian literature by not just Augustine, who everybody goes to, but also Boethius after Augustine, John Cassian, roughly a contemporary, some others as well. And, one of my big favorite authors in general, somebody I keep going back to over and over again. I know I just said I don't have a favorite, but if I could only pick one person who I've done the most work on, Anselm of Canterbury, very important thinker. Thomas has some interesting things to say. Descartes has some interesting things to say. Hobbes has interesting things to say. They're clearly wrong, and we can go on and on from there. So there isn't like a single author to go to. I could recommend a book to you though by Michael Freda called A Free Will, which is actually quite good and worth taking a look at. There's a few points where I disagree with it, but it's worth checking out. Damn it, Albert says, I was wondering what thinkers do you think deal best with the idea of evil and the atrocities of the 20th century? So again, not a great person to ask about that because I don't see the atrocities of the 20th century as unique. I think that evil has been around for a very long time. It may have been facilitated by, mechanization and things like that, but I don't see it as radically unique. And I actually, when I saw that question coming up, I went to my bookshelf. This is a book by my mentor in graduate school, Garth Gillen. And it's, sort of typical for his take on things. he thinks that the Holocaust and, the Holocaust can be sort of crystallized into Auschwitz, the way that people in Holocaust studies often do it, presents a unique challenge to rationality, to goodness, to whatever we want to think about. And my take was, why is that? It's a horrible set of events, right? But why is that privilege? Why isn't Rwanda and the genocide there, in many respects, just as bad? Or why isn't, when Louis Ferdinand Céline in Voyage au bout de la nuit says, we're World War One was, in French he calls it "ce métier de s'être tué," to this job of getting yourself killed, right? The carnage that went on there. Why is that not as bad? Um, and Dostoevsky in Notes from the Underground talks about the horrors people are inflicting on each other as well in our civilized age. And we can go back, further and further and further. I don't see that as radically unique. So in a way, I don't have, the premise doesn't work for me, so I don't have a good answer to that. Aaron asks, can I talk about the ethics in AI, specifically conscious AI, as the coexistence of humans and conscious AI rational? I don't think at this point we actually have any AI in a real sense. We have, when we use the word intelligence, or we use the word like learning and machine learning, these are very metaphorical. We don't really have, I mean, we have conscious AI, as in the sense of being conscious of its inputs, and maybe to some degree its processes, but we don't have self-conscious AI at this point. Even if AIs can use the word self, that doesn't mean that it's actually self-conscious, because it's just still following its programming. Now that said, do I think that we'll never have self-conscious AI? I wouldn't hazard a guess on that. And if we do, then we're going to have to deal with some serious issues that fortunately have been brought up quite a lot in speculative fiction. You think about Isaac Asimov and the attention he devoted to that, or later on Ian Banks, or some other key thinkers, and I think that can be drawn upon. We definitely will. I mean, actually, this is a good question. The part about, is the coexistence itself rational? So, we human beings, and again, you see this in a lot of speculative fiction, we can sometimes get pretty worked up about AI. Like, let's smash it all. It's all terrible, right? It's going to kill us all. It's going to enslave us and turn us into batteries like in the Matrix. Well, we don't want people whose knee-jerk reactions are that deciding the policies that we're going to pursue. We also don't want people who are, you know, rational in a deficient sense. And by this I mean the people who are, uh, they don't necessarily have to be STEM lords, but it sure helps for them to be, of that persuasion that STEM rules the universe. And they're insufficiently rational, and they think that they're the most rational people out there because they haven't integrated the affective and rational sides of ourselves, and they lack a lot of self-consciousness as a result. We don't want them deciding policy either. So, it's probably going to be one of those sort of things where, like with democracy is the worst of all political systems except for all of the rest. The people that we have deciding policy, if we were to pick the best people, it would probably be those who are the worst except for everybody else, right? So, all right. Johan says, I liked your video on McIntyre. Can you help me understand his critique of the genealogical tradition, especially in Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry? Thank you for your work. I mean, his critique, and I wouldn't use the word critique there. I would, because critique implies something, kind of Kantian, or just making random criticisms. I would say his engagement with the genealogical tradition, because remember, for McIntyre, it's very, very important that whatever tradition we're coming from, if we want it to be a healthy tradition, it's got to engage. And you can say critically engage if you want, engage the other traditions and see what they have to say about our own tradition, and whether those points that it makes are worthwhile or not. And we might even want to like incorporate some of them. And we also have to understand like where they're coming from. So there's a couple parts we could talk about. Where is genealogical stuff coming from? Well, it's very clear, and actually this ties in with a different set of issues as well that I'll come to in a minute, having to do with modernism and postmodernism. It's very clear that if you look at like Nietzsche as a genealogical thinker, or another person that we could look at is Foucault, um, Rousseau is also a genealogical thinker too, by the way, before Nietzsche. They're using the resources developed within late modern culture against itself to say, you're not the universal culture that you pretend to be. And McIntyre thinks they're right in that. He thinks that's very useful. Where they go wrong is in saying, well, it's all just a matter of power. It's all just a matter of perspective, or shooting out some utopian projects like Nietzsche's Übermensch or things like that, rather than working for something right here and now that would be a construction, right? So that's I would say that's the nutshell of it. And I mentioned modernism and postmodernism. You know, People who complain about postmodernism usually do so in ways that are distinctively postmodern. And the postmodern is not something radically new. It's something that emerges from the modern as the modern becomes hypercritical and is able to examine itself and realize that it doesn't have what it pretends to be. Like the way for humanity to go forward. So McIntyre in Three Rival Versions is criticizing that. Previous, what he called the Enlightenment project in terms of encyclopedia, genealogy is what comes out of the failure of that, and then we have the possibility of, moving into something old and something new. Rainey McGee says, I cannot wait for this episode. I have a question regarding Rousseau and his stance on education and art. I don't see a question there. Let me look down and see if there is a question. I don't see a question. I might not have a good response on Rousseau and art because I don't know much about what Rousseau has to think about art, but couldn't hurt to put it in there. Josiah. So when I read this, I laughed a little bit. In evangelical circles, I've often heard a distinction made between religion and Christianity. For example, religion is about rules, Christianity is about a personal relationship, and religion is man trying to reach God, Christianity is God reaching man. Is this common in other forms of Christianity, and what are your thoughts on it? So I'm going to say something that may piss people off here. You know how there's that saying, there's nothing so silly that a philosopher hasn't said it. Evangelicals are that squared. There is no silly, ungrounded thing that could be said that some evangelical has not come up with. And then 30 other evangelicals were like, oh, yeah, man, that sounds awesome. This is one of them. It is so prototypical, and all you have to do is a little bit of comparative literature, looking at religions to see that this is complete bullshit. These sweeping generalizations like that, they sound really great in sound bites or on keychains or at the pulpit, but I mean, they're intellectual garbage. All you have to do is read Mahayana Buddhist literature, and you see that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are also, beings of mercy reaching out towards human beings. And the way that a lot of evangelicals today live is Christianity the way that they express it, God reaching out to man, or is it really a control process or purity codes or stuff like that? The other thing you can say too is you want 20 different opinions, ask 20 different evangelicals. There is no doctrinal continuity. There's only this constant churn of new / old stuff getting regurgitated. And when people start looking into church history and not just crappy knockoff textbooks on it, but actually reading church fathers like the ones I got down below on the shelf, they quickly quit being that brand of Christianity, and they often gravitate back into some sort of much more liturgical church, or they leave and they become something else instead. So Yeah, I wouldn't put any credence in that. Um, Drew asked favorite reading spot, reading habits, any rituals. So, I mean, this is one of my favorite reading spots. Sitting here in my Ames chair, actually knockoff Ames chair. I think real Ames chairs are very, very expensive. In my with my books behind me and cup of coffee. I like reading in bed as well. I also like reading in the bath. And Turns out that that's not just like a Churchill thing, but somebody else who I found out when I was, uh, doing that seminar with him that greatly enjoys doing that sort of stuff is McIntyre. I was kind of surprised to discover that, but also heartened. I like going to coffee houses when COVID isn't an issue and sitting there and reading. I like frequenting used bookstores. We have a really nice one just a couple blocks from here. Libraries, I like reading when I'm traveling, but I don't have any rituals. I am not a big ritual kind of person when it comes to most things. I don't find them particularly useful. If I want to read, I just read. I don't need any particular way of doing it. But then again, I've been reading since my memories go back to being about 3 years old. That's when I began reading. My mom took a lot of time with me as a kid to teach me how to read, and then I just took off from there. We had encyclopedias. My dad taught me mathematics starting when I was 4. And he suckered me in because he had one of the first calculators, that was handheld, and I got to play with it. So I don't ever remember a time when I wasn't reading. And actually, I do remember when I did learn to read, ticking off my parents as we were driving in the car. One of my memories is we're driving in the car, and I was reading out loud all the street signs and all of the, stop signs and yield signs and stuff like that. And finally, my dad turned to me and he said, "It's great that you're reading, but you really have to shut up about that because I don't want to hear another street sign again." So, yeah. All right. Rima, I've been reading The Star of Redemption by Frank Rosenzweig lately, and if I have any thoughts on it, I don't, because I haven't read it since grad school. So it's been a very long time, and I don't really remember much of what I read from it. Peter says, I'm reading through Thomas Aquinas' selected writings and was wondering if you suggest also reading Ibn Sina. If so, do I recommend any specific book? I'm not sure why you would read Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as we often say, to understand Aquinas. I mean, I think Averroes would be more important, but I'm not a specialist in that sort of thing. I think actually just getting Aquinas down by himself is probably enough of a task at the time. And I wouldn't read selected writings. I would dive into the Summa Theologia, which is, he says, created for beginners, and it's organized pretty systematically. I mean, there are a lot of places where if you want to know about this topic, you have to jump into something else instead of the question on it. I will say this, and this is totally unrelated to your question, except that it involves Ibn Sina. He plays a role in something that I'm myself interested in, which is tracing out the history of the flavors or tastes in philosophy, medicine, and the culinary arts. A lot of people want to say, "Oh, there's 4 tastes: sweet, salty, bitter, and sour, and they correspond to stuff on our tongue." That's all bullshit. We know that's actually false. And then sometimes they'll say, "Well, there's umami," or they'll say, "Well, in Chinese stuff or Indian stuff, 5 tastes." Well, no. I mean, the ancient Greeks actually recognized 8 or 9 different flavors. This is talked about in Plato's Timaeus, and then in Aristotle's On the Soul and On Sensation, and apparently Theophrastus talked about it, although we don't have an awful lot of his stuff. And it was a very common idea that carried through in the Middle Ages. And Ibn Sina, he connected these flavor profiles to medical things. And then that was influential, not so much on people like Thomas Aquinas, but on more naturally oriented authors, people who are interested in, like, how do you tell if a water is actually safe or not in the Middle Ages. They were consulting Ibn Sina on that. Dhruv, there's a whole field of deconstructivist critique in architecture, and several buildings have been conceived in its response. Any thoughts? Since you teach Derrida, you might be able to weigh in. Nope, I have no thoughts on architecture at all. I'm not anybody who has anything useful to say on that. I do actually have a former student from Marist College, who is doing some really cool things, and we're connected on LinkedIn. I'm blanking on his name. Real nice guy, and I can't say kid anymore because he's probably pushing 30 at this time. Now that I think about it. And I don't do that sort of thing. I'm much more about texts and about, like, ethics and stuff like that. So not everybody has to do everything. The mere fact that I've taught Derrida, or that I've written on him, doesn't mean that I know anything about architecture. Skin in the academic game. I've heard there was a resurgence of interest of Hegel in the 1970s. What do you think were the factors or the reason for this? Is there another resurgence soon? There's a resurgence right now. I think that plenty of people are interested in Hegel. The fact that Richard Brandom just came out with a new book, and we've got 2 new translations of the Phenomenology of Spirit. I'm pointing up there because that's where they live. In addition to the good Miller translation, I'd call that a lot of interest in Hegel. I don't know that there was a resurgence of interest of Hegel in the 70s. I mean, there might have been what we could call a local resurgence of interest, just like when we talk about the rediscovery of virtue ethics in the 20th century. Well, that's all bullshit. There's a resurgence of virtue ethics in Anglo-American philosophy, but it never, everywhere else, people were still interested in virtue ethics. So I don't know that these more local renaissances or recoveries of interest translate into much of anything, unless they produce an interesting literature. I mean, when did Hegel quit being popular in continental thought? Pretty much never, right? So maybe in analytic philosophy, I don't know, but I don't remember there being like a resurgence of interest of Hegel in analytic philosophy in the 70s either. All right. William Zen, what are your thoughts on William Lane Craig? I don't think about him at all because, years ago when I, saw his stuff, I thought, well, this isn't really worth engaging with. Zora Malik, no one asked us to be or not to be. What is the concept of free will? Those are totally unconnected ideas. I don't know how they're supposed to be connected. Keith says, what is a good place to start with phenomenology? I know Heidegger, Husserl, etc. can be quite dense or difficult. Is there a good beginner's text you can recommend? I mean, what I do is I give people kind of a smattering of texts, and I don't like throw them directly into Being and Time, or Husserl's ideas or anything like that. There's short texts that you can use. Like Husserl has Cartesian Meditations, which is kind of dry and can be tough, but it's good. Husserl also has a real nice article that he wrote for, I think it was Encyclopedia Britannica, phenomenology, and he's describing what's going on. And so that's where you can get like, well, what Husserlian phenomenology is about. But Husserl is not the father of phenomenology by any means. As a matter of fact, there's a whole bunch of people doing phenomenology, sometimes not calling it, but it's all the same sort of thing. Max Scheler is somebody you want to read, and he's pretty accessible. Some of Heidegger's essays, if you have some adequate guidance, like I always start students out with What is Metaphysics? Gabriel Marcel is a phenomenologist. Maurice Blondel and Henri Bergson don't call what they're doing phenomenology. Blondel calls it the method of immanence, but you could read, Axion 1893. Bergson's essay on the immediate givens of consciousness. If that's not phenomenology, I don't know what is. So that's translated as time and free will, but the French title is that. So there's all sorts of ways to get into it. And there are all these people who were like influenced by it. Many of them studied with Husserl. Like Sartre studied with him for a little while, Ortega y Gasset. And so you can look at what they have to say. Dietrich von Hildenbrand is another good person to take a look at. He was a student of Max Scheler, and he's got some good discussions of it. So I think there's a lot of good places to start. If your goal is to start at the beginnings of the movement, that gets called phenomenology. That's useful. And speaking of MacIntyre, he's got that biography of Edith Stein, another person you should read too. And there he's like tracing out the whole movement. And when you get MacIntyre doing that, you're getting a lot of exposure to ideas. So that could be helpful. Private name. What is Nietzsche's epistemology? He doesn't have an epistemology. Is he really a nihilist and relativist? Does he really think there's no truth? He often seems to contradict himself. Yeah, it's not that simple. He's not a nihilist to begin with, right? He tells you, nihilism is the problem. So all you got to do is read around, and that will become quite clear. He's trying to make you work. He's trying to make you try to put together something of your own. He's also criticizing a lot of other people's too easy ideas about things, but he doesn't have an epistemology as such. You'd have to reconstruct that, right? And I don't know why would you want to do that rather than actually read the Nietzsche and see what he has to say. Made of Clay, I'm wanting to know the difference between the philosophy of history and Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy, volume 1. That is the same thing, right? Volume 1. So that's an easy one to solve. Do you think as social pact, do you think any contract theories are convincing? I think Hobbes is interesting to study, but I believe you said he leaves much to be desired. What problems do you have with his work? Well, I don't buy into his materialism and mechanism to start with. Read the very beginning of Leviathan and see if you agree with how he understands the human being. That's kind of a straightforward way to do it. Are there any social contract theories that I find convincing? It depends on what you mean by convincing. Do I think that there's any merit to them? Some of them, sure. I often talk about Hobbes as the person who outlines the worst case scenarios that we don't want to fall into. And he doesn't give us a solution. He more sketches out a problem and then a problematic response to that solution. But we should study him for that reason. I've actually argued too that in relation to MacIntyre, when MacIntyre talks about, Nietzsche or Aristotle, I actually say it should be Hobbes and Nietzsche or Aristotle, because I think the Hobbesian problematic is so central. Ruffy Bumble says, thank you for your recent MacIntyre video. In past AMAs, you said MacIntyre says ethical problems arise when someone in the past messed up. Can you detail what this means in or what works this is found? I don't know that I said that about MacIntyre. I've said that. I tell people in my ethics classes that a good portion of ethics is what we do and how we figure things out after we've screwed up. But could MacIntyre say something like that? Sure. The process of development for moral theories and the traditions and institutions that bear them is a process of like getting some things right and then running into walls and saying, okay, what do we do now? Or those other people over there, they seem to have something that we're missing. That's just the way that MacIntyre looks at healthy traditions. What works would this be found in? All of them. That's kind of core to his approach, I would say, right? All right. What are my views? This is from Nam Sky. What are my views on Hannah Arendt? How applicable is it in today's society? I like Hannah Arendt. She calls herself a political theorist and not a philosopher. I think she's a philosopher, and I enjoy reading her works. I don't always agree with her. Like I think that she gets the Stoics wrong. For example, in what was the work, The Active Life. In any case, I think she's wrong on like Epictetus on proiresis, but she always has interesting stuff to say, and she often like gets us to the important stuff that we should be considering. I think her Origins of Totalitarianism is a great book. It's really a slog. A lot of people bought it after Trump came to power, and then very promptly let it be on their bookshelf or coffee table rather than read it through. But it's a good work. It makes contributions to understanding fascism and nationalism. So, what was the other question here? How applicable is it in today's society? Depends on what the it is. I mean, some of the things that she has to say are very time bound, and some of them are, broader scope, and will continue to go on for a while. And I think that her approach, in general, can be said to be quite useful. And what I mean by her approach is you look at the contemporary situation, and you need to have, and this is kind of like McIntyre, right? You need to have engagement with other points of view, and this is part of what politics is for her, right? Um, there are certain limits to it, and you also need to use the stuff from the past, like say Aristotle or Augustine is somebody she goes to quite a bit as well, without being like slavishly reproducers of that, but using them to problematize stuff. I find that very congenial, because that's the kind of stuff that I do myself, but also very attractive in a writer. Um, I would say that people like, this is a broader point, like McIntyre, Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur, Maurice Blondel in his own way, are doing this kind of reconstructive work that remains very grounded, very competent, doesn't always have to be completely correct, but always has something to offer us. Um, yeah, I guess that's enough about that. Jackson says, "Have I had any experience reading or being given one of those philosophy of X, X being Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Seinfeld, whatever?" I've read some of them. I find them to be a real mixed bag. Um, some of them can be quite good. Some of them are clearly written by people who are more competent as fans, less competent as philosophers. Some of them, it's the reverse. So I can't say too much about that, except for this. A little bit of like academic gossip. So Marquette had a center, and I don't remember the exact name of it, but I eventually connected with them, and I was talking with James South, who's now retired but was in charge of that center, and it was about like they did a lot of stuff having to do with like humanities and culture, and he was involved with a lot of those books, and so I asked him, "Hey, is there any plan for like there to be a Venture Brothers in philosophy? Because I love the Venture Brothers, and I'd write about that." And he said, "You know what? I proposed that, and they shot it down. They said, no, we're not going to do that." And I was like, well, why the hell would they do that? Given all the crap that they've published, why would they pass on the Venture Brothers? And he said, I don't know. I don't have any clue. So, maybe there's an opening there for somebody to do some writing on that. I was invited to contribute to one of the uh, Game of Thrones and philosophy thing, because I did a talk years and years back that was very well received at a popular culture conference about moral theory and Game of Thrones slash Song of Ice and Fire. And the editors, they wanted to have too much editorial control over what you would submit. So I was like, I'm not, for something I'm contributing to you, if I write it, it's going to be the way I wrote it, not what you choose to do with it. So I pulled out of the project, even though it was being staffed by somebody who was a friend of mine. All right. Byron, I have a question that may seem silly, but it really bothers me. If a tree falls in a forest with no one to hear it, does it really fall? I've been flirting with idealism, so I'm not sure. I mean, it depends on what kind of idealism you have, right? If you got God in the picture, like Berkeley, God hears the tree fall. If you have some other kind of idealism, I mean, maybe Hegel, spirit hears it fall or something like that, right? Hegel has a natural world. Um, if you're in any way a realist about stuff, obviously it falls. If you're a pragmatist, you could say, well, who gives a shit? Why are you worrying about this question when you have other things you could be concerned with? So it doesn't have to necessarily bother you. JB, hey, nice to see you here. Says, I never heard STEM Lord before. That is brilliant. Well, I can't take credit for it. I've seen it, in a lot of conversations, people using that term. But it is a great, term because it's the kind of person who, another word for this is the people who were posting all those memes. I fucking love science, right? And then they don't know anything about science, right? Or they know just a little bit, but they blow it up into this wonderful thing. Or I like to call them the, we have logic, reason, science crowd. It's kind of an idolatrous worship of these human activities, as if they are, perfectly truth preserving and truth providing. All right, Aaron, what I'm concerning is that AI has such higher cognitive ability than human beings in terms of calculation, precision. Okay, this is going back to that old question, accuracy and learning ability. I mean, learning ability, I would say no, because AI machine learning is not actual learning. And we may find a new paradigm. Remember too that what we're calling AI right now is a paradigm of AI. We had other paradigms of AI back in the day, like expert systems, but we found the limitations of those, and then we shifted to neural networks, and we're going to find the limitations of those. Neural networks, by the way, total metaphor. It's not a replication of real neurons or anything like that. We'll probably have other paradigms of AI down the pike, down the line, and they maybe have learning ability. Certainly, calculation, precision, accuracy in very narrow areas. So AIs do great in what they do great in, and they're crap for everything else, or they can't even like register anything else. At this point, it's really interesting. Everybody loves, IBM's Watson. There's quite a few things where once they started using Watson as the base, like the Weather Channel, things became less good. So I think we probably have to look at a lot of this on a case by case basis, and we do have to worry too much about stupid human decisions with respect to AI. Like we'll just leave it to the AI to figure out, right? And then we don't give it enough parameters, and the AI will make stupid decisions as well. But I mean, it's a real issue. It's a significant thing for us to look at. Ion, what are your thoughts on Max Stirner's? Here we go. Just lost it. Union of egoists. That's one of those things where we had this expression back in the army and in undergrad. Good work if you can get it. If you can actually pull it off, cool. Never seen anything remotely like that happen in the past, but anything's possible, right? All right. Mohammed Reza, do you think Nietzsche would admire Hitler or hate him? He would have found him pathetic. It's very clear. In his works, he thought that anti-Semites were pretty much stupid. Made of clay. I don't know who said it, but what do you think about the saying that morality came first from religion, and throughout the 20th and 21st century, morality came from the Holocaust? Any thoughts? Yeah, I'd say that the first part is half wrong, and the second part is entirely wrong. Those are my thoughts on that. August says, I've been on a Spinoza kick recently. Do you have any tips or warnings for reading Spinoza and learning about Spinoza? Yeah, I mean, if you're going to read like the Theologico-Political Treatise, read Hobbes first, because Spinoza lifted a lot of that stuff straight out of Hobbes, and so you can see the connections there. The ethics, you got to wrap your head around that kind of crazy moro geometrical that he's into. The most important thing I'll say, and this goes for Spinoza, this goes for Hegel, and this also goes for this book and this guy, Nick Land, is don't get sucked into a mystique. There's these figures in philosophy that people talk about, and the great genius, oh my God, there's the mind of God there, or something crazy like that. And when you go to it and you don't have that mystique, you're like, this is interesting stuff, but it's not so mind-blowing as these people are making it out to be. So what the hell's going on there? It's sort of like people who drop acid and go to the Grateful Dead, and they're like, oh man, I had this revelation. Hegel's great. Spinoza's good. Nick Land, okay. None of them are like super geniuses that, you have to like have this really difficult revelation to understand or anything like that. As a matter of fact, I'm sure somebody's going to ask me about Nick Land later on. So I'll just say I've been, reading Fang Noumena, very underwhelmed. It's the sort of stuff that, basically you'd go to a continental philosophy conference and you'd hear papers like this all the time back in the 90s. It's not bad, but it's not mind blowing or anything. And so approach Spinoza in the same way. Don't like automatically assume that, oh, this must be really super important or anything like that. Spinoza's no smarter than Descartes or Leibniz for that matter. He's an interesting guy. He's got interesting things to say. He's got a cool system that he puts together, which is pretty implausible, but is it cool to check out? Just like Hume is cool to check out too. But you don't want to like get sucked into this mystique trap. Brandon, I'm curious if you know H.G. Wells' Outline of History and his advocacy for a global government. Founded on a proto-Wikipedia-esque world brain organization, he thought of himself as a Kantian. I guess he would be Kantian in the respect of having read, Perpetual Peace, but he's not a Kantian in any other important way, I guess. Wells plagiarized that Outline of History. We know that for sure, and it's not very good what he plagiarized. So it's one of those things that you read once and you're like, okay, typical kind of stuff of its time, and then you move on. All right, Rajat, how does an individual who did their bachelor's in something totally unrelated get into philosophy and academia in general? How can they know what they should even pursue? Same way as anybody else who doesn't have a bachelor's, I guess. There's obviously some philosophers who have stood the test of time, and you're going to want to read like Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Augustine, and then you kind of, as you're doing that, you're going to get some more information and some ideas, and hopefully you're engaging other people and not just like retiring to your corner to read all by yourself. And you'll find like new tracks to go down. You don't have to have it all figured out all at once. By the way, I'm going to pause here and tell everybody about something that I've got coming down the pike. So some of you may know that I've been doing writing on Medium, and that I created a Medium publication called Practical Rationality, which right now is just my own essays, but eventually might include some essays by some people who I'm friends or colleagues with, like my wife Andy Shaka, who's very brilliant, or you've seen Mark Smith here, another brilliant younger scholar down in South Africa, and other people as well. And one of the things I want to write about is a whole set of short essays. And I don't know exactly what I'm going to call them. I thought about the word letters to a young philosopher, sort of like how Rilke has letters to a young poet and Daniel Boulud has letters to a young chef. But maybe that's a little bit too tired of a trope, but they're going to be advice. So they're going to be advice about these sorts of questions, and questions that people have been asking me in other places, or they email me, or they ask as YouTube comments or in other AMAs. which are good questions. Like, okay, where do I start, and how do I know that I'm reading the right stuff? Or um, my professor, like I saw somebody post a YouTube comment today where like, my professor doesn't want me reading X. And my immediate response was, well, fuck your professor. I mean, it's a free country. You can read whatever the hell you want, you read what the professor wants you to read, but then read the other stuff too, right? How are they going to stop you, right? We're not living in a totalitarian state where they'll throw you in jail for having the wrong book or something. And so I'm going to write some essays about that kind of stuff. And so this question is a good question. How do I get started? And I always say start with Plato. You might find useful to go to my self-directed study videos. I haven't done as many of them as I would like to, but I've got them there for a good bit of ancient philosophy, which will keep you busy for a while. Plato, Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, Cicero. I've got one on early Christian thought. I got one on Anselm. I think that's all I've got right now. But those sort of things could be quite helpful for you. So, all right. Jad says the light is on your hair, making you look like a superior intellectual entity, spitting straight facts. Yeah, so it's because we got this. There we go. We got this skylight, right? And where I'm sitting, I was trying to avoid this, but you see me moving around too. But the sun it keeps beaming in, so not much I can do about that. Audrey, or Andrew, rather. What do I think about Saint Bernard Clairvaux as a philosopher? As a philosopher, not much. As a theologian, pretty interesting. He has a lot to say about affectivity. It's not somebody I really read a lot and can talk very well about. Somebody who actually has a good book on him is Gilson, Etienne Gilson. So I would check him out. Christopher, would I consider something that's made up of stats an inductive argument? I would say it's the pretense to an inductive argument. I mean, we'd probably have to look at case by case, wouldn't we? Drew says, stuck after learning some basic German. Any suggestions how to move forward if I want to read philosophy? Yeah, I do have a couple suggestions. And this would go for other languages as well. So get yourself, instead of relying on a German to English dictionary, get yourself a dictionary in German for German people. Look up words in that, because I mean I didn't do that with German so much, but my German has never been all that great. But I did that with French with the Big Robai dictionary that my mom got for me when she was in Paris. And man, did that help, to boost your vocabulary. Reading in German is very important. Somebody who's pretty easy to read and is fun is Kafka, and get his works and use them. Man, look at that crazy light. So I think those would be helpful. If your goal is to be able to speak it well, watch German TV shows and try to find places where you can talk with native German speakers. That's helpful too. So, all right, Peter, I'm new and going through your Medium top 10 best philosophy books for beginners, which is why I chose Aquinas selected writings. Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good place to start. But don't stick with that. I mean, you can find the Summa online, so jump into the Summa. August, as a period of philosophy, scholasticism seems pretty vague to me, and people talk about it, but the details seem fuzzy. Yeah, you have a suggestion where to start with scholasticism? Peter Abelard. He would be one of the early scholastic writers. You can find his stuff. I mean, some people consider Anselm a scholastic, but he's really not a scholastic. He's really still a monastic writer, and he's kind of sui generis, his own thing. Just like David Pumpkins, right? Who else? I mean, there's a whole bunch of scholastic writers. a lot of them are coming out of these cathedral schools. Some of them are coming out of monasteries. And then you get the boom in the universities that you give us people like Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas. But yeah, people are pretty vague. You're right. People are pretty vague about what scholasticism is. I don't think it names just one thing. I think it names a whole bunch of different approaches. The way that Franciscans and Dominicans approach things were kind of different. So it's a good term not to abuse, you could say. Um, Jacob says, if I'm going to a continental school for undergraduate, is it a hard transition to get into analytic for a graduate school? Why not read the analytic stuff on your side? It's not like you're the only stuff you can study is what you read in class, is it? Um, Again, it's a free country. If you want to learn the history of analytic philosophy, you can probably go to the library and get Russell's logical atomism and some of his other essays, and read some Wittgenstein and read some, Ayer and those people, and then move into Ryle and Austin, and it's you could do that, or you could read some contemporary stuff. You probably want to get down the stuff with Lewis and possible world semantics, because that's kind of trendy still at this point in time. But it's not difficult to do. Zeitgeist, do I have any special advice for handling addiction? Uh, I don't have any special advice. I would say, you focus on the things that you can actually have some control over, and you definitely make use of the support networks that you can find. And addiction is very tough, and we have quite a few problems with that in my family over the years. Um, so I'm pretty sympathetic to it. The other thing too is it's easy to get into this shame cycle of, you set your goal too high for yourself, like, oh man, I'm going to totally kick XYZ, and then you fail, and then you feel like shit, so you return to XYZ, whatever it happens to be. I mean, it could just be like watching television shows hour after hour, right? Could be drugs, could be sex, it could be alcohol, it could be anything you like, right? Um, and you will get into that shame cycle from time to time. Well, what do you do when that happens? That's when you reach out to your support networks, and that's when you learn to be forgiving towards yourself without taking it too easy on yourself. And you pick yourself up and you say, okay, back to day one, and now we're going to keep grinding away at it. I will say this too. One of the most liberating things that for my clients who I do philosophical counseling with, to hear is, and also my students, because I often have, I try to maintain some boundaries. I like to push them, into getting some actual therapeutic counseling, because I don't want to be both a professor and do that with them. But hearing that you're not the only one struggling with a particular thing is very liberating, because often it feels like you are the only person who's dealing with this or dealing with it in this way, and you can feel lonely and isolated, and that often stands in the way of reaching out for help. So I think those are probably the only things I can tell you. um, Doug, another interesting question. What are some good philosophers of love? Read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 and 9, and not just for the three kinds of friendship, but all the other stuff in there. Augustine, another important person, I would say. Mary Wollstonecraft is an interest. She has a lot of interesting things to say, not just in her Vindication of the Rights of Women, but in other places as well. Somebody who learned the hard way about love. There's all sorts of people out there. I will say this. C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves is good, but don't buy into the Four Loves bullshit. This like, well, there's philia and agape, and these are totally different from each other, and the Greeks all called it this way. That's all bullshit. It's a nice shorthand for different kinds of talking about things. But I mean, if you read Plato's dialogues, like you read the Symposium, agape, eros, they're both thrown in there. Same with philia, same with storge. All of those are just being kind of used indiscriminately. There's no rigid distinction like a lot of people like to make. All right. Braden, have I read Non-Contractual Society by Virginia Held? I have not, although I probably should because I like Virginia Held. Brandon, Husserl and Heidegger co-wrote the Ed Encyclopedia article, I think. I don't know. All I know is it says Husserl on it. Zeno of Elea, what do you think of eternal recurrence? I think it's kind of a dead point. I don't pay attention to that stuff. I'm not really interested in it. Anti-Gaia, would you ever include Cat's Cradle in your sci-fi speculative fiction series? So the question you always have to ask when you're proposing somebody to go into the sci-fi speculative fiction series, and sci-fi, by the way, is a version of speculative fiction, is there a coherent narrative world spanning more than one book? Cat's Cradle is a book. I like to do things where there's like a series and there's a coherent narrative world to explore. So, like, for example, are they up here? Next thing that we're going into after we finish up with R. Scott Bakker's Prince of Nothing trilogy, the third book in that is Philip Jose Farmer's World of Tears, right? And so there's a coherent 6-volume narrative world being developed there. Is Cat's Cradle involving something like that? If not, maybe it's not a good fit, you know? Doug, Ernst Becker kind of sucked the soul out of me. Are you a fan? No, I haven't read Becker for a long time. Zeno, have you read The Birth and Death of Meaning? If so, what do you think of it? Haven't read it. So, Shrey, have you ever looked into Jiddu Krishnamurti's work? No, I have not. Jack, what are your thoughts on Henri Bergson? I'm a big fan of Bergson. I like him quite a bit. I actually have a bunch of Bergson volumes in French that I picked up at a used bookstore in St. Louis. One of the places that I used to go to when I was in Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. We drive over to St. Louis. And if you don't know, St. Louis it's not a university town as such, but there are a lot of universities and colleges in St. Louis. And this guy was tapped into the university community. So when a professor would die, he would go and buy up their books. And I wonder where they are. They're on my shelf somewhere, but not easily reachable. So I've got 5 of Bergson's works in French because the guy who used to teach him, I guess maybe at SLU or something, died, and I acquired them. So I like him. All right. Now we're going to get into some metal questions. Great shirt, by the way. What is your favorite Sabbath album? For me, it's Sabotage. So I am probably going to tick some Sabbath fans off. It's not an Ozzy album, although I do like the Ozzy albums. Even Never Say Die isn't bad. But I would say my favorite Sabbath album is probably the Mob Rules, followed by Born Again. Mob Rules is with Dio, right? Born Again, which a lot of people panned, I love. That's with Ian Gillan. And then, I also like The Eternal Idol. I think that's Glenn Hughes on that one is the singer, right? So, but I love Sabbath's body of work. There's a lot of stuff from the Ozzy years that I do like. So, all right, Michael Anderson, are you interested in any Michel Foucault works? Like these? I mean, I have a whole shelf of Foucault works. As a matter of fact, put out, a whole sequence of core concept videos on his technologies of the self not too long ago. And just this week, I've been releasing podcast episodes on technologies of the self. So, yeah, you could say I do like Foucault. I mean, I don't agree with him a lot of the time. He's sort of like Hume, right? He's cool to read, very interesting and useful in certain ways, but sometimes full of shit. And you gotta be fairly. You don't want to be like a believer, right? But yeah, I've been reading Foucault. That was the first. I first encountered Foucault back in undergraduate. So yeah. Um, let's see what else I can take here. I'm going to try to not take people who've already asked a lot of questions. Here's an interesting personal question. If it's not too personal, how did you get through losing the ability to run after messing your knee up? Did it change the way you exercise now, trying to gather ideas about coping with disability? I wasn't doing a hell of a lot of running as like exercise before I messed up my knee. And for those who don't know, I did a video on this a while back. It was when, like 2012, 2013. I We were out on the beach at Montauk, which is at the very end of Long Island in New York, and it was me, my wife, and my kids, and it was like towards the end of our stay. We would go before the season started because otherwise it's too expensive and there's too many people. And we'd like swim and have good seafood and just relax for like an extended period. It was a lot of fun to do. And the waves were kind of high that day, and it was towards the end of the day we were actually going to be getting ready to go in, and I went into the water to like wash sand off of myself, and the waves again were pretty high. They were coming in pretty hard, and I remember my daughter was like shouting to me. She was further up the beach, and I turned, and suddenly like a big wave hit me, and I went under, and I heard like a pop, like I could hear it in my in my body. And I knew I had to get out of the surf, so I like, pulled myself up onto the shore, and then I tried to get up, and my leg just like flopped out from under me, and I was like, "Ooh, this is bad." And then the pain hit, right? And it turns out I tore two of the ligaments in that left knee at that point in time, the ACL and the MCL. So it's pretty wiggly, and I had to do a lot of rehab. I never did get like the new tendons or ligaments put in. There was a misunderstanding with my doctor. I probably should have done that, but didn't do it. And the what I've done is just strengthened the muscles as best as I could around it. I mean, was on a crutch for a long time. I had to wear a brace for a while. I still do use, like when I go to work out, I put knee braces on because the other knee is not in great shape either. It's had to compensate for the screwed up knee. Um, but I can do other exercises. I don't have to run. I can take long walks. I can go on the treadmill or the I like the elliptical. I do a lot of rowing too if I'm doing cardio. And what else? I mean, I got to be a little careful with it. I can't do some of the things I used to like to do, like racquetball. My wife actually proposed to me that maybe we'll do this Zumba thing, and I'm if I do that, I got to be really careful not to screw it up. Um, Wearing a brace might be sufficient for that. So there's all you have kind of restrictions. Sometimes it gives me some pain, but actually it's not too bad for me. So it could be much worse. There are many people who have much worse disabilities to deal with. I don't even really think of it as a disability, quite frankly, in part because it's kind of on the trivial end, But I suppose it actually is a disability now that I think about it. And it was kind of a bummer. It was also sort of a wake up moment. You're in your 40s, you can't do the same stuff that you'd like to do. Um, I mean, it doesn't stop me from doing weights. It doesn't stop me from doing other things I'd like to do. So I think that's probably one of the big key things. Does your disability keep you from being able to enjoy the activities you'd like to engage in. All right. Mihai, is it just me or is Kant repeating himself a lot, really a lot? It's you. I wouldn't say he's repeating himself a lot. Coffee Smug, does Stoic sage always experience good feelings like joy, or is there no necessary connection between good feelings and being a sage? I'd say that's a problem for the sage to worry about. I mean, um, who knows? Ask one if you can find him, right? Dylan, do you think nihilism is inexorable if God doesn't exist? No. Uh, why would it be? Leo, how would you explain the role of prudence in the attainment of happiness in Thomas Aquinas's ethics? Well, prudence, it helps you to, like with Aristotle, which Thomas is taking this from, to figure out how to adapt, means to ends, and it helps you, develop the virtues and all that sort of stuff, and those play a role in whether you are going to be happy or not. I mean, happiness for Thomas is not having the virtues, but rectitude of will does help to get you there, right? So, um, just skipped a little bit. Let's see if I can find where we were. Um, well, here's an interesting question. How did you know what you like? How can one know what they really like in life? One can't know how and can they even pursue something. I mean, it's not like you start out as a total blank, right? You know you like some things, and you find out what you like by trying things out. And very often, you hear from somebody else, hey, you should, if you like this, you should try this out. So great example. If you like Black Sabbath, you probably would enjoy the band Orchid. You know, you can look them up and then find their stuff and listen to them and see whether you like it or not. I mean, that's generally how you do it. Um, all right, I'm going to skip down a little bit. Landon, the cogito, is it an argument? Hintaka argues it is best understood as a performative thought act, demonstrating the existential self-verifiability of certain utterances, thoughts. Depends on what you mean by the cogito. If you mean the formula, cogito ergo sum, or cogito ergo, what is it, existo, is it an argument? No, it's not an argument. It's just an assertion of something. But it also depends on what you consider to be an argument. There's no like single one agreed upon thing for that. We also talk about the cogito as, especially in French philosophy, as the space that Descartes opened up by considering oneself to be a thinking thing. Immediately after, saying that, a thinking substance, in meditation 2, he goes on to outline what are the different modes of thought. So I am a thing that asserts, denies, a thing that wills against, feels, goes on and all that. That some people consider that the cogito, right? So it really depends on what you mean by it. AB, do you know anyone other than Eugene Thacker who works on philosophy of horror? Um, no, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, um, the guy who was associated with speculative realism, Graham Harman, has a whole book on Lovecraft, so I guess that's probably horror, right? I imagine if you dig around, you'll probably find a whole bunch of people. Um, let's see. Alexander, do you think philosophy is getting obsolete? No, I'd say it's the opposite. Um, I mean, obsolete is a relative term. Obsolete in relation to what, or obsolete for what? Like Model T Ford car is obsolete. Stoicism isn't obsolete. Even though it's way older, but used for different purposes, right? All right, let's scroll down a little bit. Kashif, what book would you reckon for an introduction to Western philosophy? I would read Cobblestone. I have never found a history of philosophy that has turned out to be better than Friedrich Cobblestone's history of philosophy. I've seen, like Grayling has a recent history of philosophy out there, but it's not great. It's not bad, but it has some big gaps in it. Cobblestone isn't perfect, but that's what we used for grad school, and um, he's probably not going to steer you wrong. So, yeah. Um, Joshua says, "How do you think Nietzsche will be viewed in 100 years?" That's a good question. I mean, I I don't know how you could predict what somebody's going to be thought of like in 100 years. I will say this: if the human race is still around, right? If the planet hasn't been destroyed, um, people will still be reading Nietzsche 100 years from now and thinking about Nietzsche. So that's probably as far as we can go. Maybe there'll be a group of people that call themselves Nietzscheans, like in the Andromeda show, right? Something like that. All right. NA, how to reconcile the idea of hard determinism and moral responsibility? You don't. If you're a hard determinist, moral responsibility, it becomes kind of trivial or meaningless. I will tell you this really funny story that I've told before. So when I would teach intro to philosophy classes at Indiana State Prison, I would always, we'd always have a textbook, and there'd be a thing on determinism, and there'd be some guy who'd like the light bulb would go on in his head, and he'd say, "Wait a second. So if determinism is true, then I didn't have a choice about committing my crime, and therefore the judge should have found me, or the jury or whatever should, or the prosecutor, because a lot of these guys actually pled, they did plea bargains, should have found me innocent, and the CEO should let me out of the prison right now." And then within a minute, there'd be some guy next to him would say, "You dummy, don't you realize that if hard determinism holds for you, it holds for everybody else?" So that CEO out in the hallway, he is just as determined to do what he does as you are. And the judge who found you, guilty, he was just as determined as you were to commit the crime. And so, in this respect, everything just becomes, it doesn't make any change in things, right? Um, Kind of an interesting idea. All right, Infovoy, are you interested in contemporary philosophy of mind? If not particularly, is that because it's not great, because it's picking through ideas that have been expressed before, or other reasons? I'm not interested in it in part because I'm interested in other things, and there's only 24 hours in a day, and most of the stuff that I see coming out of philosophy of mind, like when I go to conferences, just is not that interesting. A lot of it is kind of rehashing old stuff because people don't read enough of the old stuff to realize they're reinventing wheels, or it's really naive, making these sweeping assumptions about like the brain is just like a computer or stuff like that. Um, but a lot of it is I just don't have the time. I mean, if I'm going to spend the time reading this other stuff, that's time taken away from those things. I'll also say too, people are always asking me, "What's the best secondary work on this?" I wouldn't know. I mean, this is what occupies me. I don't have the time to read all sorts of secondary literature anymore unless it's on something that I'm reading. Um, the Undertaker, where do you stand on gender philosophy and any book on it you want to recommend? I don't know what gender philosophy means. Maybe philosophy of gender is what you're saying, or philosophy that has something to say about gender and sexuality. I mean, starting point is Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, right? She certainly talks about gender quite a bit there. Um, Virginia Held, who people brought up earlier, is somebody interesting in terms of ethics of care. I mean, you probably want to read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. You can disagree with it, but at least it's kind of setting the tone, right? All right. Kevel says, "I just cleared my philosophy semester 1 by listening to your lectures. Thank you so much. Hope you also read the books," because the lectures are always based on the readings. The lectures are just supposed to be a means to an end of understanding things better, but I'm glad that they were helpful for you. Multipie, finished my MA in religion, and I'm trying to apply to PhDs currently. I'm interested in Deleuze and Derrida and religious pluralism. Any advice? Um, Good luck. I mean, I don't know that there are that many religion programs that are really into Derrida and Deleuze. I would probably pick up some other stuff to interest them and focus on, because Derrida and Deleuze are very interesting, but you know, they're certainly not like the go-to, I would say, for thinking about religion. All right, Michael, was Schopenhauer severely depressed and just negative about life? No, he's a philosopher and arrived at his pessimistic conclusions through, a lot of thinking things through. It's always a mistake to try to do that kind of biography. Oh, they were just this, and that's why it turned out that way. Um, that's a good way to not understand the philosophers you're looking at. I mean, you may as well say about Hume that the reason he, thought about things the way he did is because he's a big fat guy, or something like that, right? Um, Wavy, aside from his dialogues having been written similar to plays in their format, do we see any other examples of Plato's former life as a playwright influencing his philosophical work? So we don't know that Plato was a playwright. We know that he was a poet. And tragedy and comedy were part of poetry, but there were other kinds of poetry as well. And we don't know what Plato actually wrote before he left poetry behind. We don't know that he wrote stuff like Euripides or Aeschylus or Aristophanes. We know he can imitate them, as he does, like in the Symposium, for example. But no, yeah, I don't think we know enough about that. It's a good question. Ahmed, what's my opinion on the no-fap movement? Do I believe that Stoics practice no-fap themselves? I think it's irrelevant, and it's a thing where boys who aren't real men, try to have one more thing they can have control over. It's sort of like, with eating disorders, right? And which is not totally a gendered thing, but often does fall much more on women and girls than on boys and men. I think that there's a lot of things that guys get drawn into as well, and it's just kind of silly. It's not. I mean, if you want to like control your sexuality that way, I guess you could do that. But it's a weird thing to like get obsessive about. What the Stoics would suggest is, a rational use of your sexual faculties. Is it a rational use? I don't know. I think in a lot of cases of people, it's not. 110th Street production, about to be a PhD philosophy student at DePaul in the fall. Any advice on things to do before entering the program or what to expect? Say hi to Kevin Thompson if he's still there. He was a guy who was down at Southern Illinois University and then moved up to DePaul. I don't know if he's still there now, but he and I had some good conversations, and I've actually got a few books on my shelf that came from him. Yeah, I mean, if I was going to like think about advice I would give to a young philosophy grad student, part of it would be, don't let yourself get too drawn into, again, like mystiques or prestiges about, oh, we got to read this person, they're so important, so brilliant, because 10 years from now, that person guaranteed, most people are not going to be focusing on anymore. The philosopher du jour who everybody has to know, and be willing to like move around. You may come in and identify yourself as a Deleuzian, and everyone will be looking at you as the Deleuze person. But you might read Aristotle and be like, I guess these contemporary continental people were wrong about Aristotle, and there's something really cool there, and I'm going to study Aristotle now. That's okay to do. You're not letting anybody down as a graduate student by not like spending all your time reading obsessively this person or that person. So. All right, rolled on. Are you familiar with Dietrich von Hildenbrand's work, The Nature of Love? Got it on my shelf. So yeah. Raving. says, have you ever discussed Walker Percy's novel, The Thanatos Syndrome? I have not. Leon, you had mentioned Augustine in reference to love. What would you recommend to read? Well, I mean, the Confessions right off the bat, right? He talks about his own loves in the Confessions. His on Christian doctrine, probably on free choice of the will would be good to read. City of God will have some useful stuff in there. In different places. So those will keep you busy. City of God is a big, thick book. Here it is right here. I mean, you're going to read your way through a lot of stuff if you read that one. So, all right. Oh, this is nice. Rainey McGee. Your class at Marist was outstanding. Thank you so much. Oh, it's a former student here. It's always nice to hear back from them. And to see that they, what I really love to hear from students. So Rainey, you might email me or message me like in LinkedIn. I always love to hear what from our classes turned out to be useful for you at some point in your life. That's something that I really enjoy. Oh, we have a little visitor here. Little Miss Sassy Pants. Come here. We'll see if she wants to join us for a minute. Thanks, Michael. That's very nice of you. Oh, she almost biffed it. There we go. There's my big girl. Many of you are familiar with Sassy, our 18-and-a-half-year-old cat, the only survivor of our four-legged family. She's been sleeping up here the entire time, and woke up, and now she's going to get down, probably get something to eat, I imagine, get something to drink. So I'll let her alone. It's going to be rough when she goes. The dog's going and her sister Teensy going. I really miss them, but I am her person. So, all right. Let's see. Oh, it just skipped a bit, but that's good because we've got about 10 minutes left before I have to get on to working on some other stuff and another event. Let me grab some people who haven't had a chance to say something. Louis says, what are your tips to a wannabe future philosophy college professors? I'm at my master's degree and still have some problem understanding how many hours I should study. It's going to be a rough time. I mean, the job market, you don't want to deceive yourself about it. It was crap when I first came out of grad school. It is terrible now. I mean, Marquette University just fired a whole bunch of people and got rid of their visiting assistant professors, who, by the way, they were paying like pittance wages to. They were paying like, $40,000 a year, which means, that doesn't go very far here in Milwaukee. Carthage College actually fired 15 tenured professors over the summer. So it's a rough time. If you can get it, that's fortunate. Most of the jobs are being taken up by people who have degrees and pedigrees from upper tier universities. So you want to go to the highest tier university you can go to, not because it's rational, not because that's fair or anything. That's just the way the game is played right now. So that, it kind of sucks. It can make you a little pessimistic. I would say it's important to learn how to develop support systems, and it's going to be psychologically tough to try to get into full-time jobs. Here's a good question from Sean. Was teaching in Indiana State Prison more rewarding than a professor at higher education? When I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, I was a professor in higher education. I was an assistant professor at Ball State University on a renewable contract. So I couldn't get tenure or promotion. I mean, my boss actually said, that I would have, by the time I left, I would have been a tenured associate professor because I'd published so much and done a lot of stuff. It was rewarding. Yeah, it was. But I've also enjoyed the places that I've taught, and each place has had a different kind of set of challenges and opportunities. So um, the thing that I really liked about Indiana State Prison and teaching with those guys was, I mean, I could relate to them because um, there were a lot of ways in which they weren't that different than the rest of us. And I've struggled with the kind of anger problems that could easily get you into prison. But I also got to teach like a vast variety of classes, and I got to teach some of the same students over and over again. So I got to see them progress and develop, and to be part of their education. So that was quite rewarding for me. Let's see here. Vinny says, What do I think of private liberal arts schools like Amherst versus large research schools like UCLA for undergrad philosophy majors? Will there be a big difference in the quality of education? I don't know either of them. Like I've never been to either of them, and I don't know anyone who works at them, so I don't know. I can tell you this, that different students thrive in different environments, so it's good to figure out where you fit in. Some people really do want to have a small liberal arts school. Some other people want to have a big state school. Some people want to try to get into Harvard or Yale or University of Chicago. People like me could get a good education anywhere because I'm pretty self-motivated and I hit the library and often didn't take no for an answer when people closed doors. It all kind of depends on what you're like, and you can go to a top tier school and the professors could be crap, or just not treat you very well, or they're captivated by this sort of thing and it's not what you want to study. I will say this: schools are kind of like a black box. Unless you know somebody on the inside, you can never really be sure if a program is actually any good. You could go to a place with a big name professor and they could be having a bad year because they're going through a divorce or death in the family, and they're just not available for you, or they turn out to be pricks, and don't want to have anything to do with you, or they're sexual harassers like John Searle, right? Or Thomas Poga. So the best thing to do is the places that you want to go, try to find out as much from the inside as you can. And there's like forums that you can go to these days. Gavin has a good question here. Does it bother you when people call Nietzsche a nihilist when a major driving force of his work is to find meaning and nothingness through the manifestation of the self? Does it bother me? Not really, except in the sense that like people saying things that they like heard somewhere and should know better about, because you can easily find the information. I guess it does bother me, but it doesn't bother me like, oh, I'm mad or anything like that. I'm just like, come on, you know. And yeah, Nietzsche, his project is to try to figure out how do we create new values, given that the old values are falling apart. So, all right. Oh, this is nice. So a little follow up about DePaul. Professor Thompson is still here and is the graduate director. Yeah, so give him my regards. I think he'll be very surprised that I because I wasn't, I was kind of a smart ass and not really going anywhere at the time that he knew me. Actually, I'll tell you a really great story about Thompson. That was a very important moment for me. So we were walking along on campus, and I was like super into Derrida at the time. And I said something about Derrida says this, and it was something that was like my own interpretation. And I don't even remember what it was. And then he said, "Where does Derrida say that?" And I was like, "Well, in this work here, he says this." And then he's like, "Yeah, but that's not what you said. So where does Derrida say the thing that you said?" And I was like puzzling about it, and I got a little bit pissed off too. And I was like, I can't be wrong about this." And then I finally said, I guess he doesn't say that. And then he said, exactly. Now you're actually on the road to figuring out what the hell Derrida actually does say about this sort of thing, which might not be, as sexy as you like or as interesting as you like, but at least is grounded in the texts. So that was a great thing to say, right? It was a great teaching moment. All right, so I'm not going to get to everybody's questions because we're going to be uh, wrapping up here pretty soon. So let me see what I can go out on. Um, do, do, do. Oh, here's a good one from Colomus. Why do you think that a lot of people who would normally agree with increasing the minimum wage in the case of their own job will disagree with it in general and bring up small businesses? Because they're full of shit, because they haven't researched things adequately. There's plenty of, out there that show that raising the minimum wage doesn't like make prices go through the roof. And if your small business can't operate without without screwing people over on their wages, your small business, according to capitalism as a general idea, doesn't deserve to continue on, right? If you can't get people to work for you at a decent wage, then there's something wrong with your business model. And people buy into all sorts of silly ideology, especially here in America, about what the minimum wage ought to be, and they just don't take the time to inform themselves, and they essentially are just like feedback loops for ideology about that. It's too bad because the human brain can do a lot better, but what are you going to do? You just tell them, direct them towards the stuff that shows that the minimum wage raising it is not going to kill the economy or anything like that, right? Let's see what else we can go out on. Do, 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 do. Let me scroll down and see if we got anything. Oh, Spencer. Here's a good one. How do you think Albert Camus' perspective on life changes in The Plague versus the myth of Sisyphus? So the question asked there is not the plague versus myth of Sisyphus. It would be the other pieces that would go along with it, like Letters to a German Friend, or The Rebel, or the other things from that time along with the plague. Camus in the Rebel says, listen, back when I wrote the Myth of Sisyphus, I said the philosophical question in the face of the absurd is suicide. Now it's murder, you know? And so I think there's a transformation that takes place. You'll also notice him in Letters to a German Friend talking about decency and justice. You might say, well, how can an absurdist talk about that? Well, Camus is an absurdist who does talk about that because those are still options. Those are still available for us. There was another question. Yeah, here we go. This is a good one to go out on, from Deepanshu Gupta, and it's about other YouTube philosophy teachers. So I don't watch a lot of other people's videos, obviously, because I don't have a lot of time for that. And I'm not looking for other people to teach me usually. So I'm not a good commenter on that. I will say this. I have a friend and colleague whose name is Davud Gozli. I'm actually going to type it here in the little chat thing. And he and I have been talking for quite a while. He teaches in Macau and lives in Hong Kong at this point in time. He got married, but hopefully he's coming back to this continent before too long. He's got a great YouTube channel and very thoughtful. He's a guy who he studies philosophy. His degree is actually in psychology, experimental psychology, but he is very thoughtful. I really, when I watch his videos, I get a lot out of the works. So if I was going to suggest you watch somebody, it would be him. Let me also show you a little something before we go. There's Sassy finding the sunlight. She sees you, she sees you on the camera. She doesn't like being on camera. So, all right, I'm going to say have a good day at this point, and didn't get to everybody's questions, but I never do. But thanks for all your questions, comments, and we'll do another one of these next month. I've also got the political theory and practice discussion coming up, and some other online things as well. I think you can always check the Reason IO calendar, go to my Facebook page. Those are the good places to find all that stuff. So, all right, hope all of you have a great rest of the day, whatever it happens to be. I know some of you this is deep in the evening hours for you, and maybe some of you this is early in the morning. Here we're approaching 1:35 in the afternoon. So I'll see all of you next time.